Simon, thanks. That was a fantastic introduction, and you actually got what we do absolutely right. So that means there's more time to spend with Malorie. The only thing I want to add to that is the fact that she's been described as the national treasure. I have no idea how you take that, particularly from the Times, but also the fact you've been name-checked in a Tiny Tempest song, which I think is pretty cool. I think that's pretty cool. Robbie Williams, well anyway, the fact that Noble Conflict was launched in June, just to give you some sense of how we're going to do today. I know, because of the emails I got in advance, that a lot of you have questions that you want to ask. So even though it's called in for conversation, I will not keep away from you for too long, promise. So we'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then Malorie will read an extract from her new book, Noble Conflict, and then we'll open it up to the floor, and then there's a surprise after that, but I won't say anything yet. So Malorie, fantastic, great to see you. I have to ask you, you have 15,000 books allegedly in your home. Is your home a mansion?
No.
I mean, where are they kept? And also, more importantly, have you read them all?
I've read about 3/4 of them, and I do not live in a mansion, far from it, and they are kind of just stacked up. We've got kind of every room, apart from the couple of loos, have got bookcases in them, and so we've just stacked them up, and they're sort of 2 and 3 deep. And then we've got them on the floor, and then they're all packed up in the attic, and we've got back-to-back bookcases in the attic, and they're just kind of like, so the whole place is just books.
And you've collected them over what period?
Well, since my hubby and I have been together, so 31 years, 32 years.
Okay.
But I mean, a lot of those were from the time I had my first Saturday job when I was 14, and I could afford to sort of start buying books for myself. Yeah. So some of them are even that old. 1 or 2 from my old school, but we'll cough. that I kind of forgot to put back.
Stop filming. Okay.
But most of them are kind of because my hubby loves reading as much as I do, so they're kind of things that we've got, and it was his collection and my collection that just came together as well. But his is more sort of mathsy and physicsy, and mine is definitely sort of on the sort of fiction side, and kind of like, artsy subjects and art, etc., and music.
Well, if someone, I can imagine someone asks to borrow the book, I can imagine you keeping track of that. It's missing.
Well, I'm very protective of I don't mind lending them, but I expect to get them back in the condition they were lent out. One of my hubby's friends used to, every time he sort of borrowed a book, or every time he reads a book rather, his philosophy is he reads a book and he tears the page out. And that way, every time he opens the book, it'll always be on the right page. So I just said, no, I don't think he'll be borrowing any of our books anytime soon, but there you go.
I mean, you've been writing, in your own words, for your own amusement since the age of 7 and 8. And you've been a full-time writer for about 23 years now. What triggered the initial passion to write, and what sustained it over this time?
The initial passion came from my love of stories. And in fact, from the time I was 3 or 4, Mum and I used to sort of share fairy stories together. And then from when I was sort of 6, 7, I started going to the library by myself. And I'd just make myself a packed lunch and head off. And because my dad was a great believer in education, and it was all about education and facts. And so we had Encyclopedia Britannicas, the sort of ubiquitous books that every black family had. And we had sort of books on nature and all kinds of non-fiction subjects. Very few fiction books, because his attitude was it was complete and utter waste of time, and I'd never learn anything from fiction, so what was the point? But he was very strong on me getting a good education behind me. And so from the time I was 7, 8, I'd kind of lived down my local library every Saturday. And then I would read the books, and then my mum would read the books, and we'd discuss fairy stories. And I loved myths and legends and fairy stories from around the world. But because the children's books were very, 5 go off here and 5 go off there, and the chalet stories about sort of a boarding school in Switzerland, which were lovely to read, but were way outside what I knew of the world, etc. So that's why by the time I was 10, 11, I started reading adult books, because I felt I didn't recognise the world that was in the children's books. I loved it, but I wanted something that I felt was more like the world as I thought I knew it at the tender age of 10. But at the same time, I think it was also writing was my way of dealing with things and making sense of the world, and making up my own stories. I was a terrible daydreamer. And I used to live in my head a lot, and I was a middle child, so it was kind of, it was a lot, I felt a lot of the time I was kind of on my own and by myself anyway, so I'd make up stories and poems, but it was always for my own amusement, because it never ever occurred to me, and it was never, and writing was never given as a career option. So it was one of these things that I just did for my own amusement.
It's funny because two questions I'll ask you later, I'm going to push them forward now just to follow on from what you said, because one of them, bearing in mind that you said, 5 go off to Dorset or whatever else, didn't reflect your life or your life experiences. I can imagine how powerful and also daunting it must have felt at 23 to engage your first black characters in a book, which was Alice Walker's Colour Purple.
Yeah.
I mean, that must sound astounding to most people, but one, what does that feel like? And I think, two, in retrospect, how worrying was that, or is that for you?
At the time, when I was at school, I remember I was in a history lesson, and the teacher was talking about something or other, and I said, well, why do you never talk about black achievers and scientists and inventors? And she said, because there aren't any. And I couldn't come back at her because I didn't know any. But I thought, I'm sure that can't be right. You're telling me there's no black pioneers throughout the whole of history. And so when I was in my mid-20s, I found the black bookshop in Islington, and thank God for that shop. It's shut down now. It's shut down for a while. But that's where all my money went, because it was like practically every fortnight I'd go in there and just load up 2 carry bags worth of books, and it was black history and black pioneers, and learning about people like Matthew Henson and Dr. Daniel Drew and Charles Drew and Daniel Hale Williams, and learning about people like those that I didn't learn about at school, and also coming across people like Maya Angelou and Alice Walker and Buchiya Machita, etc., and devouring them. I said, and that's why, as part of the laureateship, I was talking about embracing books for children that are more culturally diverse. And some people seem to have had a real problem with that. It kind of makes me think it's kind of fascinating, the response I've had to just that, which I kind of felt was kind of an obvious statement, because is there anyone who would argue that in the adult world, people like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie or Buchiya Machita or Jan Martel or Amy Tan or John Steinbeck or all these others who are bringing new different cultural perspectives to the world of literature have not enriched that world. And all I'm saying is, let's have some more of that in the children's world. We've got Asterix and we've got Tintin and we've got the Moomins. Yes. But how many people would be able to put their hand up and name 5 books that have been translated into English within the last couple of years? I'd say very few. And in fact, so I've just been sent some to read. But I'm just saying, we send an awful lot of books out into the world. It would be nice to bring some into translation and just have some different cultural perspectives, as well as having some BME perspectives based in this country, but again, reflected in the literature that we actually have out. I think that serves everybody. And I think, unfortunately, for some people, they kind of, but especially when I first started writing, not so much now. But I think the response I got from booksellers, a couple of editors, and some librarians, I have to say, was if it's got a black child on it, then no white child will want to read it, which I always felt was more indicative of their attitude rather than the child's attitude, because I've never come across a child who says, it's got a black child on it, I don't want to read that or whatever. It's about, well, what's it about? And they want to engage with the story. So you grab them with the story and you've got them. But this was the comment, as I said, I kind of got levelled at me. And so reading Alice Walker was such a revelation. And then I was lucky enough to meet her when she was doing a signing at the Silver Moon Bookshop a few years later. And this is when I was kind of getting rejection letter after rejection letter, when I'd started sending my stuff out. And I'd hit about my 50th or 60th rejection letter. And then this was for about my sort of 5th or 6th book. And I went to a signing that she was doing, and I got to the front of the queue, queued up for 2 hours, got to the front of the queue, and I said, could you put don't give up. And she said, well, I can't put that. What does that mean? And I said, because I really want to be a writer, but I'm getting so many rejection letters, so would you mind? And she looked at me and she said, don't you dare give up. Yeah. And she wrote it, so I've got, in one of her books, it's kind of to Malorie, don't give up, and then Alice Walker, which I cherish. And I thought, well, I can't give up now. Alice Walker's telling me I can't. But it was, I think it was reading those books that suddenly, it was almost as if reading them, something clicked in my head, and it was almost as if I gave myself permission to try and write and get stuff published. And, and again, I've had comments from people saying, but, every child will think themselves into a book, so you don't necessarily have to have children of colour in the books as you put yourself into whatever book you see yourself in. Yes, you do. I mean, otherwise, I did that, and I loved reading because I could actually put myself in the book, and I could be Lucy going through the wardrobe into Narnia, and I could be all these other characters. But I was very aware of the fact that I was not reading about any children who were my colour, and it did make a difference. And I think it was reading these books when I was older that gave me the idea that maybe I could write too, and my voice was valid. And I think and I think that's why I think it's important for all children to have access to culturally diverse books. It's not just about you have a black child in it, so it's only for black children, which is the statement that that was given to me when I first started writing. But it's about these books are for all children, and so that's what I'm keen to kind of get out there and bang the drum for.
I mean, do you think that mindset is still prevalent within the mainstream publishing industry, which is the white majority experience doesn't need to be questioned because it reflects everybody, but as soon as you put a black experience, all of a sudden then the scrutiny is there to say, well, actually, that isn't everyone's experience, so it will marginalise everybody. I mean, do you think that's one of the biggest challenges, the fact that it's almost tacit that the white mainstream experience is unquestionably there for everybody, reflective of everybody?
I think it's partly that. I think also what it is, though, is this thing of if you write a book about a particular black experience, suddenly it's every black person's experience in the way that... in a way that doesn't work the other way around. No. So if you have white characters in a book or a film or a TV program, they represent themselves.
That's
if you have a black person in a book, then it's kind of, but, do you want to say this about black people? I mean, I was watching a documentary a couple of weeks ago where Alice Walker was talking about the stick she got for the colour purple, because it was as if a number of people, black and white, were saying you shouldn't have written this because this is kind of derogatory about black men, blah, 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 as if suddenly you write a black character and it's every man or it's every woman, and which puts an additional pressure on you, because I think... but that said, I always wanted to write children's books. Part of that was because I kind of felt I would have a freedom in writing for children, an unquestioned freedom, where I would be questioned about my motives and why are they doing that and blah, 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 if I was writing for adults. And it was also because I went into a children's bookshop when I was 24, 25, and saw one book that featured a black child on it, and that was James Berry's The Thief in the Village and Other Stories. And I thought, hang on, you're telling me that nothing has changed since I was a child? We've got the one book. And that's when I thought, okay, I'm going to try and see if I can get some book, a book of my own published. It wasn't some books, it was a book at the time. And then I just kind of thought, and as soon as I was a computer programmer at the time, so it was kind of working at night and trying to get my books done at night. And it was as soon as I had started, within a kind of couple of days of writing with a view to trying to get it published, I knew I had found the thing I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And it's like everything just clicked into place in my head, and I thought, this is what I want to do. But I couldn't afford to give up my job because we had bills to pay. So it was a question of working during the day, coming home, having my dinner, and then working, and then writing at night until 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. No social life for a couple of years, just trying to get these books out. And what I did was, when I sent mine out, I'd immediately start working on the second one. So I'd think, well, if they don't take that one, then maybe they'll take this one. So
I want to actually look at your writing process and just get your some idea of what works and doesn't work for you. I mean, how long does it take you to write a book? You know, what was actually the hardest for you? Come up with the characters, the plot, or the actual writing itself?
As far as how long does it take to write a book is concerned, it depends on the book. And so something like Noughts and Crosses, for example, that took me a year. But that was a quick year, actually. That was a fast book to write, because when I sat down to write that, I was angry. And I was angry when I first started writing. I wanted to write all the books I'd missed as a child, the mysteries and thrillers and whodunits, etc., that just happened to feature black children but weren't overtly about race. But they had black people on the cover and they were about black children's adventures. And from my first book, I was always being criticised because, from in certain quarters, because I had people saying to me, "Why aren't you writing about racism? You should be writing about racism," as if as a black writer that was the only thing I was qualified to write about. And oh my God, it used to get on my nerves. So but I thought I can only write what I can write. And this is what I want to do, and I want to write these adventure stories. But then I'd written 49 books, and then I watched, and it was around the time of the Stephen Lawrence case, and I watched a dramatisation of the way the Lawrences were treated, and I was so angry. And this story had kind of been stewing in my head for, a few months, maybe a year before I actually sat down to write it. But I think that was the catalyst for me saying, okay, now I'm ready to sit down and write about racism. And it was also a number of things in my own childhood which I thought I had dealt with, but all I had done is bury them. And so when I was writing Noughts and Crosses, suddenly all that stuff came out, and it made it an incredibly painful book to write, but it wasn't a difficult book to write at all, because I had things to say, and in fact there were a number of things that I kind of thought, well, can I put that in there? Can I put that in there? But it didn't serve the stories, so it had to be left out.
Is that why you ended up it becoming a series?
Well, I think in a way it did, because I had I had my story arc in my head. What happens before I start writing, I tend to get my story in my head. I get the plot, and then what I do is, what takes the time for me is working out my characters. And I need to have the right name for them. So I have a book of baby names at home, and then flick through them, and I love the meanings of names and so on. And so it's getting the right name, and then I do mini biographies of my major characters, and I don't start until I have my major characters and I know who they are, and I feel like they are real people in my head. And it's almost, it's going to make me sound like I'm barking, but the way it works for me is if I'm it's almost like they're talking to me, and it's like, look, these characters are whispering in my ear and they won't leave me alone, so I've got to write their story down. And with Noughts and Crosses, I kind of cheated a bit, because Seffi's character I had to work on, and that idea of kind of being, you're rich and you're kind of born into the world of privilege, etc. But Callum was easy, because Callum was me.
Yeah.
And it was, and a lot of the things that Callum goes through when he's at school were absolutely based on true stuff that happened to me. And like the first time I travelled first class on a train, and the ticket inspector accused me of stealing the ticket. The history lesson at school. My careers teacher, when I said to her I wanted to be an English teacher, saying to me, black people don't become teachers. And she said, why don't you be a secretary instead? And I looked at her and I said, I don't want to be a secretary, I want to be an English teacher. And then she said, well, I'm sorry, but I can't give you a reference for that. And she said, black people don't become teachers. And she said, why don't you go to, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a reference to go to Poly and you can do business studies. And I said, I want to be an English teacher. And she said, well, I'm not going to give you a reference to do that. And I thought, well, without a good reference, I'm never going to get into Goldsmiths. But then I went to Huddersfield Poly, and I started a business studies degree, and halfway through the first term I was rushed to hospital to have my appendix out. And then I gave up my place because I loathed the course anyway. I love the business law, and a bit of the accountancy, but that was it. And the sort of things like economics, and it would, oh my God, and the lecturer would be going on about price elasticities, and I'd be sitting there going, oh, that cloud looks like a terrier. And I was bored out of my skull, and so I gave up my place, but then I applied to Goldsmiths because I had the grades for my A-levels by then, and I got in. And I thought I'd defer entry for a year so I can make some money, and I started working at a software house, and I got hooked on computers, so I gave up my course. So I never did come to Goldsmiths, but as far as the actual writing side is concerned, that's why it was a painful thing to do. But it wasn't writing Callum especially wasn't hard, because, as I said, he was kind of the way he felt about things and what he experienced was so based on a lot of the stuff that happened to me as a teenager. How I felt as a teenager. I was a very bitter teenager. As a child, I was kind of, I love everybody, and I thought everyone loves me, and and you kind of live in your own little bubble. And then as a teenager, the real world started impinging, and it was people spitting at me and telling me to go back to where I came from, and all of this. And so there was a stage when I was getting very bitter about it. And luckily, I kind of, something happened and I kind of pulled back from that, and I thought, okay, I'm turning into the very people I despise, and I'm not going to let that happen. And it was a conscious decision to almost remake myself and kind of think, I'm not going to drag around all this hatred with me, it's too heavy. And so, but that said, the feelings that Callum had and that kind of thing of, you just want an education, you wanted to be treated the same as everybody else, but it doesn't happen, and that turning in on itself and how it can make you very bitter, that was very easy to write. So, but the story arc about Callum and Seffi and their daughter Callie Rose was in my head before I started, but I did think it was going to be, I was going to fit it all in one book, but it didn't happen.
I just want to throw something out, because most of the people we've spoken to, and even adults, have sort of, without a pause, say that Noughts and Crosses, this is my second copy, is their favourite book. Anyone else? Yes. Yeah? Because why I'm saying that, because I think it's interesting you revealing the motivation behind the book, the emotions behind the book, because I think it's really interesting that some of the young people who entered the competition, we did a competition for young people to meet Malorie and read from their favourite book. Noughts and Crosses was up there, and they were very, very clear about what resonated for them. But I want to come back to that. Okay. And I think it just feels that what you say about the experience of being a teenager and the specific tribulations you went through. But your books do not patronise young people and children. Your books deal with big themes, war, racism, class, new technology, loyalty, politics, big, small, and draws heavily upon history. I mean, there's elements of like the Black Power movement in Noughts and Crosses. Yeah. And one of our young reviewers who just reviewed Noble Conflict, for example, she said, the conclusion, it's worth reading, it'll be on the site tomorrow, said that you seem to be prodding and encouraging children, she made a point, children, to think for themselves and not take the perceived wisdom as gospel, and to think about life's big moral dilemmas. I mean, would you agree with that? And do you think some of that is to do with the fact that you were allowed to be an English teacher?
I would agree with the comment. I think part of it is the whole purpose of education, surely, is to encourage our children and to teach our children to think for themselves. And to not just think, but think for themselves. And I think the whole thing about children being tested to death, and what the education is turning into a series of, can you pass this test? And can you pass the next test? And so many teachers have told me that's what they're doing. They're teaching to the test. They're not teaching. And for me, it's about, so when I was a teenager, I hated people talking down to me. And I hated people thinking, treating me like I was an idiot. And saying, well, this is a grown-up subject. You don't need to hear this kind of thing. And it just drove me mad. So I try really hard to make sure that I'm not talking down to children. If anything, I think they are such a perceptive audience, and you insult their intelligence at your peril as a writer. And I do feel, it's like things like, I wrote a book called Pig Heart Boy about a boy who who has a bad heart. He knows he probably won't see his next birthday, and he needs a heart transplant. And his dad, in desperation, writes to a doctor, and he gets a heart from a genetically modified pig. Now, the only criticisms I've had from that are from adults, and the criticisms were, the main criticism was, do you think it's right that you wrote a book about a boy who's facing his own mortality? And I'm sure children don't want to read that. And I thought, and so my response to that was, well, are you saying then if a child is ill, that they should be ignored in the world of literature, that we shouldn't be talking about that subject. And he said, well, I'm sure that children don't want to read that. And I said, that's not been my experience. And if anything, what you're doing is these books, all books, I would hope, are teaching children to kind of empathise with others, whether it's a disability, whether it's colour, whether it's religion, whether it's gender, whatever. That's the point, surely. But his thing was, well, I don't think it's right that children should be reading about that. And I said, well, you don't have to buy the book then, but again, it's fascinating to me that there's so many adults. It's like they hit 20. Or maybe sort of older, and then they forget that they were ever teenagers. And I just find that really, really strange. And so for me, it is about tackling subjects that I would have been interested in as a teenager, still interested in, but doing it, getting to the universal through the specific. So I'm trying to have my characters get on with their life, basically. And whether it's other people as the antagonist, or whether it's society as the antagonist, as it is in kind of noughts and crosses, whether it's the authorities in noble conflict who are spinning this big story about who the society's enemy is, and Casper begins to realise that actually they haven't been told the entire truth about this. And again, with noble conflict, it was based on things like the Tuskegee experiment and the Milgram experiment, the deferring to those in authority, and the Tuskegee experiment where the 400-odd sharecroppers, African-American sharecroppers, were told that they could come for a free health screening, and they had they took the ones who had STIs, and instead of treating them, because this experiment went on from 1932 to 1972, and in the 1940s, when penicillin was then freely available, they chose not to treat them because they wanted them to die so they could give autopsy, so they could see how this STI affected their bodies. And it was only in 1972 that it sort of all came out and they closed down the experiment, etc. But it's this whole thing of they thought they were getting free healthcare. They were told, come here for your free healthcare in the Tuskegee Institute, and they weren't. What they were doing was they were being studied like rats. And I that sort of thing I find really I still find really shocking, and especially when I first read it. And the whole thing about the Milgram experiment, where you're told by someone in authority that you have to keep electrocuting someone, and 9 times out of 10 people were doing it, and they could hear this. It was an actor, but they didn't know that, so they could hear this actor going, I don't like this, let me go, let me out of here. And the person in authority sitting behind the participants would say, you have to carry on with the experiment, you must carry on with the experiment. And even though it ran contrary to the conscience of a number of the participants, they would still carry on pressing these buttons, where the voltage was going up with each button. And I found that absolutely fascinating. And a friend of mine, when I was in computing, said to me that Hitler's ovens could burn in this country and no one would give a damn. And I was so angry. I said, how dare you? And we Brits wouldn't do that. And we would stand up to Nazis and blah, blah, blah. And then I watched things like the Milgram experiment and this deferring to authority, and I just think, I wonder. And now I must admit, and whereas in my early 20s I was absolutely sure it couldn't happen, and part of me still clings to that and says no, it couldn't happen, but there's a part of me that thinks but that said, you see, then I just think that I would hope that enough people will stand up and say, you know what, no, and would be counted, like the poor case of Lee Rigby, and you had those women going forward, and the 2 women who tried to comfort, Lee Rigby, but it was too late, he was dead anyway, and the woman who kind of stood up to Michael Adebowale. But again, it was about these women coming forward and stepping forward. And I've had that in my own life, where things have happened, and I've thought, oh God, how are we going to get out of this? I mean, just a little thing, for example. My hubby and I were on the motorway, and we were in an accident, and the car was kind of a total write-off. So we were standing on the hard shoulder. Thank you. Word to my tool. And we were sort of standing on the hard shoulder, and our daughter was like 18 months old. So there's me standing with Lizzie, and I'm waiting for the tow truck to arrive. And car after car after car stopped behind us and said, can we take you somewhere? Would you like a lift? We can take you into Derby, whatever. And there must have been about 10, 15 cars that actually stopped and offered to help before the tow truck arrived. And it was like, and it was so lovely because I wasn't expecting it. And I thought, well, you know, and it was hot and I was miserable and whatever. And they said, well, I can turn off at the next service station, bring you back some water and whatever. And I just thought, aren't people wonderful? You know, and it was, and again, I kind of believe, maybe this makes me sort of a cockeyed optimist, but maybe I do believe that people will, in the end, when it gets to it, will stand up for what's right.
One more question, and then you'll do a reading on
Okay.
noble conflict. I'll just cut it short. I have some more, but I really want to hand over
Sorry,
to the
am I
audience.
whispering?
No. I wish we had more time actually. But what I wanted to say is, I mean, the Children's Laureate post is actually only 12 years old.
Yes, that's right.
And Ted Hughes and others had to argue for the post, isn't it, amongst publishers? And I mean, and you're the 7th. Eighth, sorry.
Yeah.
And why do you think this role is needed, particularly in this current climate with what's happening in education, which you've already been vocal about? I mean, yeah.
I think it's absolutely needed because there needs to be a voice not just for children's writers and illustrators, but for children's books and children's reading. And the whole idea of reading for pleasure, which some people seem to have such a problem with. Oh my God. And I think it is about, I mean, the wonderful thing about the role is each writer or illustrator who does it can make it their own, and they bring their own passions and interests to it. And my passions are teenagers reading, young adults reading, and upper juniors reading, etc. But it's about also, there's so many pressures on teenagers anyway with set books and exams and so on, that for me it was about just trying to encourage children to read for pleasure and show them that there are so many books out there just waiting for them in all kinds of different forms, whether it's a story told in narrative verse or a graphic novel or whatever. Trying to introduce them to a broader range of books, more diverse writers, and also it's about, for me, was part of what I wanted to do is try and encourage every primary school child to have a library card, for schools who don't do this to try and get back to a 10 minutes a day storytelling time, which again I think engenders a love of stories, and hopefully then children will then want to seek out their own stories as well. So you know, and it is about things like saying, well, if you're interested in this subject, there's so many different books on that subject. Or if you're interested in just this genre, let's check out some graphic novels, let's check out some classics, let's check out some modern stuff, and just showing them the whole world of literature. Because every time I go into a school, one of the first questions I ask is, hands up those who love reading, and then hands up those who don't like reading. And there's always a few hands that go up. And I say, well, you can't have found the right books for you yet. And then what are you into? And then trying to kind of get them engaged in the idea of reading. And so for me, it's really important because I wouldn't be sitting here now as an author or as a children's laureate if it hadn't been for my local libraries in Lewisham and Deptford when I was growing up. I mean, God bless libraries. And I just think this whole idea of libraries shutting down, because local authorities have had their money cut by central government, so they need to make cuts, and so libraries looks like an obvious kind of target, and that has to be resisted. The whole thing of, for example, this new asinine idea of kind of splitting children into these 10% grades, where if you're in the top grade then you're laughing, and if you're in the sort of next grade then maybe you can kind of move up, but it's like setting everybody else up as a failure. You're telling 11-year-olds they failed. I have a problem with that, and I just think I just wish that head teachers and teachers and the Department of Education could sit down and not just talk to each other but actually listen, because I think we over-test children in this country, and I do feel that we have to be very careful about the message we're giving the majority of our children by saying children aren't stupid, and if they know they're not in the top 10%, are we saying then you're a failure? And why are we doing this? Is the idea then that are we going to do something constructive with this and say, okay, let's talk about how we can maybe help children to achieve their full potential, or is this just a way of grading children so that when they go to secondary school it's, well, you got this in this particular test and so let's put you in this bottom set and so on, so you get less resources, etc. So it just worries me, this whole idea of these 10% bans, and I just not sure about the thinking behind it, to be honest. So And my thing was, I must admit, I kind of, when they said, would you like to do this? Because there was a short list of 15. And then I heard kind of towards the end of April that they asked me, would I like to do it? And I said yes, but I said, you do realise that if there's something I disagree with that any government's doing, I'm going to say. And they said, that's what we want. And I thought, well, I hope so, because, you know, there's things I don't agree with, I am going to say, and I'm going to write articles, etc., and I'm going to, you know, be a voice for that. And I think we absolutely need that. I think in certain quarters, it's good that they feel that they're being watched. And their actions are being kind of scrutinized, not just from me, but you know, everyone in the sort of children's book world, etc., to make a noise about it and say, you know, if councils feel that libraries are an easy target to close, for example, then we need to stand up and say, excuse me, no, they're not, and protest about it. And I do feel that if you're one of the lucky ones where you have books at home, and you know, and parents who can afford them, etc., then you are very lucky, and all power to you. But there's a lot of children for whom that is not the case. And for me, with, you know, being one of 5 kids, and my parents split up when I was 13, and for me, the libraries were a godsend, because I could go and I could do my homework in peace. I could, you know, it was somewhere warm to go. I could go and I could just escape into these books, and yeah, I don't know where I'd be without my local library, and that's why I kind of feel really passionate about it, because, you know, my daughter's lucky because we've had all these books in the house and we love books, etc. But as I said, I didn't actually go into a bookshop until I was 14. I couldn't afford to buy a book until I had my first Saturday job when I was 14. So, you know, if it hadn't been for my local library, then God knows where I would be.
And second-hand bookshops, because what I used to do right next door to the library that I grew up in, Tottenham, is a massive library, really helpful staff and staff of different sort of ethnic backgrounds. Right next door, there's a second-hand bookshop, but also you could exchange books. So I always read up. I was reading people like Updike and so on. You know, most people in my family, my sisters here, I think, were in the top band because we read up. There was no limit on the books. You graduated really quickly through books. And also the television had to be off at certain times. It did help. Last question before we move over to Noble Conflict. Just really quickly, I know that, you know, Noughts and Crosses, fantastic book, adapted by the RSC. My niece, who's in her 20s, was even in London, bought the ticket, said, "Auntie, you're coming." It was fantastic. It's going to be a graphic novel.
That's
shortly.
right, yes.
When's that?
Next year.
Okay.
So, and John Aggs is doing the illustrations, so I'm so excited about that, because I love graphic novels, so it's going to be brilliant to see how it works. And in fact, we're having a meeting in the end of August about the sort of script and how it's going to work as a graphic novel, but he's going to be doing the illustrations, so I can't wait.
Film next? Film?
I hope so.
It seems like a long journey, but I can see it being, it's very filmic.
Well, we came close a couple of times, but it didn't happen.
Right.
So I'm hoping it will be third time lucky, so, you know, kind of. But if I had £1 for every time someone said, "When's it going to be a film?" I'd be a rich woman. You know? But I live in hope. I live in hope. So.
Malorie, thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Malorie to do a reading from Noble Conflict. Okay. And then it's over to you guys.
Okay, I'll make it short. I'm just going to read from this, actually. And for those who don't know, that Noble Conflict is about a sort of teen called Casper, and he's joined the Guardians, and the Guardians are a kind of cross between the army and the military. And they've been told that their enemy are a sort of a group of people called the Crusaders. And the terrorist element within the Crusaders, they're told that when they capture them, they're put into a maximum security facility, sort of like a prison. And the bit I'm going to read now is where Casper finds out what really happens to all these so-called terrorists that that they capture. And there's a place called the Clinic, which is kind of like a huge hospital, and there's a north wing which is meant to be abandoned, and he's going to find out exactly what's going on with the terrorists he captures. So much for the north wing being abandoned. Senses on high alert, Casper peered through the glass panel in the first door on the left. The vast room was empty of both people and standard hospital furniture. Instead, it had a whole wall filled floor to ceiling with large drawers, each of which looked big enough to store a body. A morgue. Caspar shuddered. He'd never liked morgues. The door had a datapad beside it, set in the wall. Caspar swiped his fingers across it, only to be confronted by a series of numbers and names that meant nothing to him. He made his way to the second room. He peered through the glass panel again, but had to duck down quickly. The 2 doctors were in there. Fortunately, they were too busy to spot him, but this room seemed to be the same as the first. One of the drawers was open and the 2 were peering in. Caspar ducked beneath the glass panel in the door and headed down the corridor. The third room was the same, as was the fourth and the fifth. Each room was full of body cabinets, some against the walls, whilst the majority were placed back to back in columns throughout the room. Each door had a datapad beside it, filled with virtual page upon page of numbers and names, or, more often than not, the word unknown. How many bodies do they have in here? Thought Caspar. This old building wasn't derelict at all. It was air-conditioned, spotlessly clean, and full to the rafters with neatly filed corpses. So why all the secrecy? He flicked through the datapad outside the room at the end of the long corridor. The numbers, were they dates? Yes, they had to be. All the dates on this datapad were recent, within the last 3 months. He needed to get a closer look. Only just suppressing his natural instinct to avoid dead bodies, Caspar slipped into the room, carefully shutting the door behind him. Apart from a faint but constant buzzing noise, it was quiet inside. And at least it didn't smell like a morgue, just a standard hospital smell. He approached the wall of drawers and peered at the closest one. Near the handle there were a cluster of LEDs, presumably to show the status of refrigeration. Caspar pulled tentatively at the handle and the drawer slid out smoothly to its fullest extent with barely a sound. He was right. There was a body inside, but it wasn't dead. The occupant of the drawer wasn't a corpse, but a patient. This one was a man, naked and fully plumbed in with tubes, catheters, drips and electrodes attached to various parts of his body. He was motionless apart from the slow rise and fall of his chest, but his eyes were open and his eyeballs were scanning rapidly back and forth like someone in a dream. But there was something strange about his eyes. Caspar bent down for a closer look, only to recoil, shocked. The man's eyes were open and would remain so, permanently. He had no eyelids. Looking down the body, there were numerous fresh scars where there had obviously been major surgery. Caspar was about to close the drawer again when something made him walk down to the man's feet and look at him the right way up. A shock of recognition made Caspar gasp. This was the black guy he'd encountered outside the Level 3 comms building in Western Avenue. What had happened to him? Why was he in such a state? During the attack, Caspar had knocked the guy out cold, but he would have sworn the man was completely uninjured when the medics picked him up. Now he had scars everywhere. And what the hell had happened to his eyelids? So that's where he finds out that all the terrorists have been, they're filed in these drawers. They basically kind of cut their eyelids off so that when you shut the drawer, they play kind of like nasties, like scenes of torture and manipulation and terror, etc., to them to drive them nuts. And you find out the reason why. But it's I like the expression on your face. But and again, it's about, I suppose, again, as I said, it's not just the Milgram experiment and the Tuskegee experiment, etc., but things that are done in our name, which most of us don't want to know about and I'd rather not hear about, but things like rendition and getting information from terrorists using torture, etc. And I just kind of felt I wanted to kind of write about that, but again, experiencing it through Caspar's eyes, and I do believe you can get to all these kind of sort of bigger themes, etc., through being very specific and following one character and how and things are revealed to them and how they kind of get to grips with the world, etc. And that's the way I like to write anyway.
It's hand you some flowers. We asked, what can we get? A chocolate, alcohol, whatever.
Flowers.
Oh, it said flowers.
I
yes.
love flowers.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Malorie, thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, they're beautiful.